You know, it's funny, without those AV techs, none of this would happen, so they really do deserve all the respect that we can give them, because, I mean, jumbotrons and confidence monitors and all that stuff, but those guys in black, they're designed to not be seen as they move around. It's kind of cool. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. So, there's always this question, right, whenever you're speaking at conferences. So, is it harder necessarily to start out the show like first thing in the morning? Right? Is the hardest session the first thing in the morning, right after you get out of bed, you're still kind of groggy, your coffee's still working in, or maybe it's the one just before lunch, right? Just before lunch, you really don't want to be there because you'd rather be in line because you know how the line is, right, to get to lunch. Honestly, I sometimes think that the hardest session in all of Tech Ed to teach is right before free beer night. Don't you think? I'll do my best to get you in the front of the line, right? But remember me when you're filling out the evals, right? My name is Greg Shields, and I'm a MVP with Microsoft. My MVP is in RDS. I'm also a partner and principal technologist with Concentrated Technology. That's concentratedtech.com. And over the next 75 minutes or so, I want to talk to you about, well, the whole process you go through for extending those applications into the cloud using RDS. Let me ask you a question here. You've used RDS before, right? We've used RDS before, fairly familiar with it. What do you think? Nice. Who's got a yay? Nobody. Who's got a All right. So, RDS has been around for a long time, right? I mean, RDS started as Thermal Services, and then back years and years ago, we finally decided to change the name and also the product, I think, as they were changing the name. Now, what's interesting about this move to RDS is how we can now use Microsoft technologies to take the traditional terminal services we've been using forever inside of our LAN and actually extend it successfully anywhere with an internet connection. Now, I'll tell you, you're probably here today because you may have the perception that doing this is challenging, do you? Does it feel like this is a hard thing to do and do it successfully with authentication and authorization and password control and all that? Well, it doesn't necessarily need to be if you put the right pieces in place. And so that's what I hope to do over the next 75 minutes or so, is assist you with that whole process of taking probably the RDS that you probably already have, those of you that had your hands raised, and with just a little bit of additional technology, extend that out to really anywhere on the internet. Now, what's most important before we get into the security piece is just a recognition that the TS to RDS move, right? The changeover in Server 2008 and again in R2 is really gets rid of the whole notion of desktops. We don't have to worry about just desktops anymore. I don't have to worry about giving my users those complex start buttons and all the other things, the desktop associated with giving them a desktop. I can give them other mechanisms with which to access their applications and data. And this is fundamentally important. So notwithstanding just the security pieces associated with terminal services and RDS, there's also a whole application delivery piece associated with it too, right? We've been RDS admins for years. Now, let me ask you this, right? As an RDS admin, don't you feel like we really are like the cream of the crop when it comes to IT pros? Like we are the top end IT pro, don't you think? Would you agree? Can I get a hey yeah? We are. We're the top-end IT pros because not only are we server administrators, and we also have to be workstation administrators, right? Everybody's played systems babysitter before where, so-and-so is working on the terminal service box, and then so-and-so needs to connect in, and we got to stop some processes and all those activities. We have to be application aware as well. We have to be smart about those applications and whether or not they work inside the terminal services environment. We have to lock things down. We have to be involved with security. And really now, with 2008 and specifically with R2, we have to be conscious about the ways in which we do application delivery, or we deliver the application to our users. Have you thought about this? Have you really spent time to consider the different ways that you can actually get that application delivered to the user? This is important because this is understanding what this piece is. It helps you determine how you're ultimately going to deploy that application to the users once they're out in the cloud. What are those ways to deploy apps? There are quite a few. Not the applications themselves, but the deployment mechanism associated with those applications. Right? What are those? I don't know. We've been doing RDP file distribution for a very long time. Right? That's where we create some sort of application, or even back in the Terminal Server 2003 days, where we'd create a connection to a server, and then we'd put some RDP files out on a file server somewhere, and if somebody needed to connect to the terminal server, they could grab that RDP file, and poof, there they were. Right? Did this work? Kind of. It kind of worked in many cases, but really it wasn't really terrifically administrable. So with 2008 R2, we gained some new flexibility in the ways in which we deploy those applications. And again, these are important for how we deploy those applications into the cloud. The first is RD Web Access. Anybody here using RD Web Access? Surprisingly few. Do you like it? It works. It does what it's supposed to. We also have the ability to take the application, the RDP file, and wrap it up into an MSI file, which we then install onto a desktop. If I want to get really crazy, I can go and combine that local desktop installation with client extension reassociation. I'll talk about that here in a second. And at the end of the day, the most interesting of these is this whole notion of remote app and desktop connection, which we get with Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7. Now, all of these are mechanisms that you will use to deploy the applications to your users. And I bring these up in a lot of ways because you kind of have to be aware of these things, right? You have users that are going to be out on the internet. You might not necessarily have control over the applications that you're deploying to those users, right? You might not necessarily have the ability to install an application to them. So something as simple as RDP file distribution, which in the old days was the only way to distribute connections, well, maybe a good way for you to actually get that connection to your users. Anybody here heard of a technology called Remote App for Hyper-V? Anybody? Remote App for Hyper-V. If you're taking notes here in this class, a very interesting technology that Microsoft has released. It kind of works. But Remote App for Hyper-V provides a way for you to create a VDI environment, but only make available the application installed onto that VDI desktop. So I spawn up a VDI desktop and then present the application off to a user. If I don't want to do full VDI environment, this is a great way for, well, if I have some small applications that need to be in a VDI environment, but I don't necessarily want to create a very large one. Fantastic solution out there, Remote App for Hyper-V. Now, RD Web Access got a lot of attention back when we were doing the 03 to 08 conversion. Hey, we've got this website now that's just like the XenApp website, the presentation server website, where I could go and have my users log into a website and click on a link, and when they click on the link, poof, they get access to the application. Now, this is really easy. I can easily provision these applications. I can easily deprovision them, and that's the real power of RDWA. When I'm done with the app, if I have to take it down for service, I can do that with Remote App or with RD Web Access, and that's fundamentally important for the use case of when you would use it. Now, most of us inside of our environments are probably going to use, this is the link here for where you'll actually show an application in Web Access inside of the Remote App Programs console. But most of us inside of our LANs are probably going to use some sort of mechanism to do local desktop installation. Okay, I create a remote app, and then after I create that remote app, then I use, I don't know, group policy or config manager or shoe leather or whatever sort of mechanism I want to go through in order to deploy that MSI file to my users. Okay, we all have group policy here. So deploying that remote app becomes very simple when I wrap it up into an MSI installer. Uninstalling it is a little more complex, right? Because I've got to go through the reverse process to remove that MSI. I can do that here inside of the Remote App Console by clicking Create Windows Installer Package. Now, for those of you that ever tried to do packaging don't you wish that we had create Windows installer package for every single application out there? Wouldn't that be nice? Once I create that Windows installer package, I use some delivery system to install that onto my systems, and I'm good to go. There is a checkbox whenever you go through creating that remote app that's honestly a real smart checkbox to select. And what it does is it enables client extension reassociation. Now, what is this? When you're going through and when you're starting up Microsoft Word, what's the first thing you do to start Microsoft Word? Do you start Word, or do you double-click an existing application or an existing file that you have? Probably the file. Right? How often do you really go to Start, Programs, Microsoft Office, Microsoft Word, File, Open? It's like an 8-step process. And so this additional checkbox here allows our users to simply double-click the existing files that they have, and the extension of that file will determine whether or not it's local or whether or not it's remote. I'm essentially reassociating those client extensions to the remote app program. You look under Tools Options, and this is what it looks like. The Set Associations default field there will link, for example, Dock or DocX or whatever to that remote desktop connection. So for users that are on the LAN, at least in the beginning, having the ability to double-click those files, this makes the whole process of launching applications from your RDS server essentially seamless for them. Because I double-click, remote app spins up, it loads that document, and I'm off to the races. This is the fourth of the fifth. The fifth here is remote app and desktop connection. Now, everybody here, all of you here, are at Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7 100%, right? Right? All of you? Anybody here nod at that? Oh, okay. So a few of you, right, haven't completely and totally upgraded to Windows 7. If you are one of those organizations that is completely at Windows 7, you got to figure that this whole process of installing and uninstalling applications and remote apps is kind of challenging when I have to deal with MSIs, right? You know, one of the reasons why we might consider upgrading ourselves to Citrix is because with Citrix I get that cool XenApp client. You know what I'm talking about, the XenApp client, which is in the lower system tray right there, and in the lower system tray it populates my start button for me. And because it's populated, then I can remove applications and they somehow magically disappear from the start menu or the desktop. Well, Microsoft kind of stole some of that technology back from Citrix and created what's called Remote App and Desktop Connection with Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7. It's kind of like the XenApp plugin. Essentially, every client on an hour-by-hour basis checks in with the mothership to see what applications have been configured for that user and for that computer. And if they're configured, well, then it gets updated. Relatively useful in the LAN environment, but as we move into the cloud environment, it can be somewhat challenging because, as you can see, the process by which we go about making that connection involves an HTTPS call. So, very useful tool, something you got to be conscious about as you're moving those applications into the cloud. Any questions about this? Any thoughts? Is this fundamentally exciting? Greg, I thought I was here to hear about securing, and you're going over desktop delivery approaches. Well, that's next. You know, we have to be aware of how these applications get delivered, because the delivery mechanisms are really what drives how we end up securing those mechanisms. And the primary mechanism, the primary thing that we have with Microsoft for securing that user's connection is the remote desktop gateway. It's a new service, came out originally with Server 2008. It's been updated with some very useful stuff with Server 2008 R2. The RDG is the gateway, as it were, that gets your users out in the outside world, wherever they may be, into those applications that are inside of your LAN already. Now, the cool thing about the RDG, what's fundamentally cool about the way that they implemented this thing, is that you can take your existing infrastructure, all the applications that you've already made available today, and just simply put the RDG in front of it. Take that remote desktop gateway, stick it right in front of the thing, and suddenly the users outside on the inner tubes in the internet can make use of the same applications with no change in their processes. That's pretty cool. Let me show you how it works. So in order to be able to do this, you're going to need a few things. Right? We're going to need we're going to need the RD gateway server, for example. Right? We've got to have this gateway that exists somewhere in our LAN. Okay, we have to have some sort of certificates involved, right? One or more SSL certificates, generally from a public CA. Got to have a firewall. I mean, anybody here not have a firewall? Hopefully we all do. And we have to have some holes in that firewall. And that's it. If you go and you look through the Microsoft documentation, it might seem a little more complex than that, but that's really all that you got to have in order to get the thing going. This is what it looks like. So here's a client that's sitting in my home, right? myhome.com. That is not my URL. And, well, it connects in over 443 TCP to the remote desktop gateway server. And then once there, then I connect over port 3389 to, well, my terminal server, remote desktop session host. Ta-da! I'm done. Open those two ports and you're good to go. Silence. There's got to be something here, right? There's got to be something itching in your head here. What's itching in your head? Anything? Well, first and foremost, well, wait a minute. Right? So if I have the internet, and then I have my intranet, and Greg, you're saying, okay, well, you want me to open up port 443, well, as we all know, commonly used port, from the internet to my intranet to any kind of server. Well, this is going to be somewhat challenging unless I have some sort of additional protections in the way. And I've got to have some other stuff in there in order to make this work. Well, luckily, there are ways around this whole need to open up this internet connection. Most of you are not going to necessarily allow a direct 443 connection into your intranet. Probably. The network security people are going to tell you, no. They're good at saying that. So there are a number of different architectures that really enable this connection to occur. What's interesting is that not all of them are completely obvious in the way that you would actually configure them. So I want to spend just a minute and kind of drawing out here on the screen some of the different architectures that you can use for actually getting terminal services running through that firewall. Okay? Let's begin. So in the simplest case, right, in the simplest case of them all, we don't necessarily even have to have a DMZ. There are some business environments where, well, we don't have DMZ hardware. We don't have DMZ software. We have no mechanism with which to create any kind of DMZ. And so the only place we really have is the LAN and not the LAN. In this case, well, what are we doing here? Here I've got my little live draw thing that I'm going to take a look at. What are we doing here? I've got my intranet, and maybe I don't even necessarily have this DMZ located here right in the middle. And because I don't have that, the only place where I can put that RDG is, well, right here inside of my intranet. Most of us are not going to support this configuration. Most of us are going to have issues with this configuration because in order to open this up, the connection between the inner tubes and down here to the remote desktop gateway is going to require a TCP 443 connection between the two. However, this is a completely acceptable configuration if you're okay with having that port being open between those two locations. All right? That's only the first, though. That's arguably the least secure of these. Most of us are going to have some sort of DMZ, some sort of security control that exists between us and the internet. Now, because of that, we can also put that RDG in the DMZ. Okay, and effectively all I'm doing here with this process is taking this RDG server and sticking it right up into there. Now if I put that in there, if I make that configuration where I move the RDG into its own DMZ, what am I losing at this point? What am I losing? Anyone? Oh, Active Directory. Right? If I move my RDG out into the DMZ, right, what services are available typically in that DMZ? But not many. In Windows Server 2008 R2, the RDG was upgraded with the ability to install that RDG as a work group member and not necessarily as a domain member. Now what this does is this allows me to move that RDG out into the DMZ. I can do that successfully, but for my users to be able to come into my internal LAN, I'm going to need to create a second set of usernames and passwords and credentials and all the management that's associated with connecting to that RDG. Some businesses, this is not a big deal. Right? Your users are probably already familiar with having some sort of separate logon with key fobs and extra passwords and usernames and what have you. So moving that server out into the DMZ, not a big deal. Others are looking for a more seamless experience between the two. Who here, just a curiosity, who here has separate password to get through your VPN? Anybody? None? Those of us that don't have that separate password, that have a single integrated, single sign-on situation, can make use of the third option here, which is still with the RDG in the DMZ, but that RDG is then going to use internal Active Directory. Right? I've got some sort of internal domain controller, perhaps. Maybe I move an RODC out into the DMZ. Maybe I do a Forest Trust. Now, what this provides me is that ability to get domain services out here into the DMZ. Right? Perhaps I make some sort of significant connection between here, this RDG server, and my domain controller. Right? I got a whole bunch of services here that or ports that I'm going to open up through that firewall. Anybody know which ports are required to open up through a firewall in order to get domain services to operate through that firewall? Like all of them, right? Maybe not all of them, but a significant number of ports are required in order to do that. So pulling that out into the DMZ, possible, but all the ports that are necessary to open up is almost worse than opening up that single port from the internet down into my LAN. So maybe this isn't a great option. A second potential here, this is Microsoft's recommendation, is to instead of opening up all of those authentication ports from server to client, instead 3B involves you creating some sort of RODC. Right? I've created a read-only domain controller. It's relatively protected. I only have to open up I only have to expose whatever users are allowed to access from the internet to that RODC, because the RODC protects just whatever groups it's told to localize. But the problem here is that even in doing this, I still have a lot of ports that I have to open up. What kind of ports are involved between two domain controllers? Also, a significant number of ports. Your security people probably have fits thinking about the number of ports that are required to do that. A third option is a Forest Trust to another domain controller in the DMZ. So in this configuration, I have my internal LAN, I have my external LAN that sits relatively empty and exists simply for the purposes of creating this trust between these two locations. Do any of these excite you? Any of these seem like a great solution for whatever your needs are? Admittedly, right? These are not really, I think for most of us, remember I'm not from Microsoft, I think for most of us, these are not really workable solutions for many of us in our business environments today, would you say? Luckily, there is a fourth option. And that fourth option is really the industry's and Microsoft's recommended practice. And it involves the use of some special services that exist out there in that DMZ that provide the necessary connections to domain controllers and Active Directory. Right? Option 4 involves installing not the RDG into the DMZ, but instead an ISA server or the new Forefront Threat Management Gateway or some other sort of reverse proxy that supports RDG into that DMZ. If I put that in there, I can expose whatever verbs are necessary in order to get the connection to occur between the outside world and the inside world, right? So what this looks like is instead of going down this route, I instead keep my remote desktop gateway here inside my LAN. And instead, I front that with an ISA or a TMG server. Whatever sort of server you can go the Microsoft route or whatever route you want to go. I'm in a Microsoft event. You're going to buy the ISA server or the TMG server, install it in there. Forefront Threat Management Gateway is more or less a reverse proxy solution. And reverse proxies are being used in enterprise environments everywhere as a mechanism to bridge external SSL connections into your inside LAN. There are all sorts of different solutions out there that provide this capability. Now, what it does is it takes a look at any inbound SSL connections as they're coming in. So this is still port 443 coming into your DMZ, right? So the inbound connections as they come in and they hit this threat management gateway server. Right? And this is protected traffic. This is SSL protected traffic. So it's encrypted. Right? It's been authenticated. And what the TMG does, first of all, is it actually decrypts that SSL communication. Once it's decrypted that communication, it takes a look at it and says, any kind of malicious code here. And then ultimately then passes it back on to the inside. Now this is useful for me because this solution, this reverse proxy solution like the TMG, provides a mechanism to sever the connection at the DMZ and reconstruct that connection from the DMZ inbound. This separation provides the level of security that we and our security regulations require. Are you using this? Are you using some sort of reverse proxy today? This is a solution that you don't necessarily get directly out of RDG. The Remote Desktop Gateway does not support this functionality. That's a separate product with the Threat Management Gateway, so there's additional technology that's required to get put in place for this to work. Now what's interesting is some organizations may want the traffic, after it's been reconstituted at the other side of the TMG, to be re-encrypted so that when it comes inside the network, it remains encrypted and it can't be peered into. There are two different settings, I'll show you what these settings look like here in just a second, that provide a mechanism for you to choose whether you're more interested in internal security or if you're more interested in slightly better performance. So HTTPS to HTTPS for better internal security, or HTTPS to HTTP for slightly better performance. Now, when we go through and install this RDG, right, there are a couple of things we have to do. Obviously, we have to have, again, be ready with those firewall ports. We have to be ready with those server certificates. When you get ready to install, let's say you already have that TMG sitting out there and it's ready to go and pass the traffic onto the inside, and you're ready to go and install the Remote Desktop Gateway, there are going to be 4 questions asked during the installation. First and foremost, you're going to be asked for your server authentication certificate. Right? There's a special server authentication certificate that's required by the RDG in order to support what it does. There are also going to be a set of user groups that are allowed to connect to internal resources through that RDG server. Okay? So generally, you know what these are. And then lastly, you're going to have 2 different sets of objects that you have to manage at the Remote Desktop Gateway level. They're called RD caps and RD wraps. Right? And I like to think of the caps and wraps as the mechanisms that authenticate the users to the gateway server and then ultimately determine what resources are available out on the other side. I'll talk about these in here in just a second. So if you're looking for certain certificates, certain SSL certificates, what kind of certificates do you require? Okay, obviously it has to be a computer certificate. Right? You're using this computer certificate for server authentication. That's the specific OID number that's required if you end up purchasing this from somewhere else. And very important is that your subject name for the certificate, the value that's in the subject name field, must exactly match the RDG's external fully qualified domain name. Right? Because this is a server that's existing in the DMZ. And that server in the DMZ, the certificate has to match what that server's name is for users that are coming in from outside that DMZ on the internet. If you plan on sending connections both from the outside world and from the inside world, you may be interested in purchasing a certificate that supports both your internal namespace and your external namespace. Right? Most of us don't have the same namespace inside of our LAN that we present to the outside world. And there are certain certificates, subject alternate name certificates are one option. There are some other options out there as well that support, wildcard certificates are another one, that support the ability for that certificate to essentially handle both internal and external DNS. This is really important so that you will have an appropriate authentication against that certificate. Now lastly, and this is something that kind of gets forgotten sometimes, is that the certificate must be installed to the local computer's personal store and not the current user's personal store. And this is kind of odd because by default the certificate wants to go into that local computer's personal store. You will know if you've done things right if the first screen in the installation looks appropriate. It actually shows the certificate in that first screen during the installation. Now you may be asking also, well, can I buy a certificate? Or can I just use one from an existing certificate services server that I have? If you are skilled with certificate services, if you're someone that has plenty of experience, if you've already distributed certificates out to the laptops and desktops in your world, you can use an existing certificate from your cert services. But it's sometimes easier, particularly if you have unknown clients that are connecting in. Right? Users' home computers or computers that are kiosks in hotels somewhere. It may be easier in terms of headache and heartache for you to purchase a certificate from some third-party trusted store. This certificate gets installed to that remote desktop gateway server. This is the first screen whenever you first install the RDG. And one of the very first questions that gets asked is essentially point me to whatever certificate I need. Now you'll notice here that I have a cert that's showing up here in the little white dialog box. And if I see that certificate in here, then that means that I've created the correct certificate with the correct OID and the right reason for being, and it's in the right certificate store. If I don't see this certificate in that box, well then I know that there's something wrong with the way that I've actually installed that cert to my server. Okay? After doing that, though, the next important piece has to do with those RD caps and RD wraps. You can think of a remote desktop client authentication protocol and a remote desktop remote access protocol as bridging who should be allowed to come in from the outside. Right? That's the arrow there on the left. And then once they've hit the gateway, what resources will they ultimately be allowed to, well, to use once they've correctly authenticated? It's the who on the left and the what on the right. And the combination of that RD cap and RD wrap is really what creates the entire bill of materials for getting some user in from the outside world into the inside world. The RDG itself is not a real big consumer of performance. Right? Studies show, at least Microsoft studies show, that a single, 2-processor server, 4 gigs of RAM, can support about 1,200 concurrent connections. So all this server is doing is really doing that bridging between outside and inside, and this is not a task that requires a lot of resources. In fact, Microsoft even recommends virtualizing the RDG just to make it easier on you. Now, interestingly enough, down here at the bottom, if you're using Windows Server Standard Edition, you might be able to support 1,200 connections, but you're limited, you're hard limited to just 256 concurrent connections with Standard Edition. Now, hopefully not many of you have to deal with more than 256 connections at a time. Right? That's a lot of concurrent connections going on at the same time. But if you do anticipate the need for that, well, you might consider upgrading to Enterprise or Data Center Edition. That's one of the benefits you get by spending the extra money. So this is sort of the theory behind the RDG. Okay, these are the architectural pieces that are required in order to get that gateway, well, positioned correctly. Well, all right, well, how do I, that's great, Greg. How do I actually go and configure this silly thing? Let's take a look at it. So here I am with my Visio diagram, and I'm going to do exactly what I've set up here. Okay, I've got this RDG server set up here, down here at the bottom, the desktop gateway server down here at the bottom. Now what I want to do here, and I recognize we're having a little AV trouble here, what I want to do is take a look at, where's my RDG server? Here it is. So this is a server that's sitting out there. This is my RDG server somewhere out on the internet somewhere. And I've installed the Remote Desktop Gateway role service from Server Manager. Okay, and in there I can take a look at all the different settings. I have down here connection authorization policies and resource authorization policies. And both of these are the two halves that I showed you before, the RD cap and the RD wrap. Let's take a look at some of these connection authorization policies here. I've created one here with order 1, and the policy is just RDCap is the name of the policy. If I take a look at the policy, you'll see that I can select what types of users and also what types of computers by username or by group that I want to grant access in to the RD gateway. This is kind of cool. Now, first and foremost, you probably have some sort of user group that you want to give access to. Maybe they're a group that's signed the acceptable use statement for connecting in remotely, or taken your I'm connecting in from the outside world training, or what have you. Well, this is useful because you can put those users, you can put the users and groups in that top box right up here for user group membership. If I leave that bottom box empty, however, if I leave the bottom box empty, all computers will be able to connect in. However, if I'm looking for additional security, I can actually put computer accounts or groups of computer accounts into this bottom box to limit which of the laptops I want to allow to come in from the outside world. This makes things a little bit more secure and protects me against situations where a user might have their own home computer, or again, some hotel kiosk computer that may not be protected enough for my specific requirements. Again, apologize here for the AV problems we're having. So once I get in, I have some options here for what types of things I want to make available for the users as they come in. And this is called device redirection, right? I can choose to disable certain types of devices, drives, clipboard, the printers, ports, supported plug-and-play devices, from the connections that are coming in through that gateway. Now, why would I do this? Why would I be interested in eliminating those capabilities for people when they're coming from the outside world? Maybe I am trying to protect myself against data loss, so I want to make sure that I can't actually do clipboard mapping. I can't copy and paste data from the outside to the inside. Maybe I don't want to expose my drives so that somebody could be at home and copy a bunch of files down and then easily get rid of a bunch of the things that I have, or steal the data that I have. Maybe I don't want to support printers and print jobs because I don't want people printing to the inside, because those print jobs consume a lot of bandwidth in order to do that. All of these are available here by disabling that device redirection. Now, on the third tab, as soon as it comes back up, on the third tab here, I have the option of selecting specific timeouts for those sessions as they go through the Remote Desktop Gateway. Now, these timeouts are your usual timeouts, you know, the idle timeout. If the user's not doing something for a period of time, do I want to time them out? Or do I want to have a total session timeout? After a certain number of minutes, no matter what you're doing, I'm kicking you off. Okay, so if you've played with terminal services, you're familiar with these timeouts. The useful part of these timeouts is the fact that, again, these timeouts only exist when that user is connecting through the gateway and not necessarily from the inside. Now, that's the TS cap. Okay, that gets me from the outside world into this gateway. The second half of this is getting from the gateway then into the resources that I need on the inside. I've got to figure out what kind of resources I want to have out there to provide to people on the internet. And because those resources can be secured, I want to make sure that I have good security, I might want to limit these pretty significantly. Now, first and foremost, I want to determine which user groups can actually connect to resources on the inside. Okay? Which users are allowed to come into the gateway, and then which users are allowed to connect to remote computers through the gateway, in one side and out the other. Once I've determined that, I can select which options or which machines out on the inside that I want those users to connect to. This is particularly useful for allowing access for users that are in the outside world. Maybe they have a desktop in the inside and they have a laptop out on the outside. This is particularly useful for those users to allow them to connect even into their own machine. Right? Windows 7 supports remote desktop. Windows XP does too. I could provide, using the remote desktop gateway, I could provide the ability to simply allow those users to connect in from the outside world, directly into their desktop and continue to work. It's kind of like a little mini VDI situation, even though there's really no V to the DI, right? Now, the last thing I have here is a selection for the number of ports that are available for me. By default, remote desktop RDP operates over port 3389, or I could change the ports if I wanted. If I were particularly insecure, I could also allow connections through any port. Okay, but these are just the options that we have here. Most of us are going to leave this setting here at the top selection, which is allow connections only through TCP 3389. Now, that's pretty much the options that you have with a gateway. I didn't show you, there's a little tool in there that lets you look at the connections and see who's connecting in and how long they've been connected and what their machine is that they connected in on. Very useful for the monitoring things that you may need and the logging, if you have any audit requirements, or for seeing who comes in and what they're doing when they come in. All of those are available in that third section there called monitoring. But really, that's all that's necessary in order to get the RDG up and running. Now, there is a couple of other things we have to do. Obviously, I've got users out on the internet, right? And if I give them a basic RDP file, right, that RDP file is not necessarily going to know, without a little assistance, where it needs to come from and where it needs to go. Because what's an RDP file say, right? It's got the URL or the address of the server that we want to connect to. Now, I need to augment that RDP file with a little bit of additional information. And this additional information essentially instructs whoever is double-clicking this RDP file that in order to get to whatever application you want, it needs to go through some sort of gateway server. And this is done whenever you create the remote app inside of your RDSH machine. You install the application, you expose the application with Remote App Manager, you go to this RD Gateway tab here for the remote app deployment settings, and you set it up so that you use the RD Gateway server, in this case server1.contoso.com, and then ultimately create that RDP file and distribute it out to your users, and they can double-click it, and off they go. Right? That's done here inside of, wrong button here. That's done here. If I go to Start, Administrative Tools, Remote Desktop Services, and Remote App Manager, and then I take a look at the applications that I've created here inside of Remote App Manager. Let me go ahead and have this pop up here for just a second, and I'm going to show you where you'll actually go through to configure the applications that you want to expose to the outside world. Let's say that I have Calculator right here, and I want to view, for example, the properties for the RD Gateway so that Calculator and the other applications that are on this server will be able to connect to that outside world. Here under the RD Gateway tab, you'll see I can choose to automatically detect those RD Gateway server settings, or I can choose a specific RD Gateway server. And then I have a couple of additional options down here at the bottom. these options you have to be really conscious about. When you are creating connections, when you are determining how the users are going to connect into those applications, you have a couple of different options for, well, what's going to happen first of all, well, when the user is inside. And second of all, do you want to set up some sense of SSO or single sign-on between the gateway and the session host itself? Okay, the top box here allows the user to use the same user credentials for the gateway and the session host. If you've extended out your Active Directory, or if you've used a TMG server so that it is the same credentials, this will enable you to have a more seamless experience between double-clicking that application and then ultimately launching it inside your LAN. Now, the second piece is somewhat more challenging, because some environments may not necessarily, when that laptop comes back into the environment, they may not necessarily want the connections to have to go through the gateway server when they're already in the LAN anyway. Right? There's almost no need to go through the gateway in certain circumstances unless you want to log every connection through that single location. If you don't care, this second box, checking it, which is not checked by default, enables when that computer is considered local, when it can talk to its domain controller, then ignore the gateway and connect directly into whatever application server that you're looking for. I'll tell you, in implementing this across innumerable situations, this checkbox is useful if you don't require it, because it eliminates some of that multiple name certificate requirements that you would need if you have a different namespace between inside and outside. If you don't have to have your users on the inside connecting to the gateway, this second checkbox is probably the easiest solution for you, because it eliminates a lot of the complexity as people move inside and out. Any questions about that? Now, you know as well as I do, if you've played with RDS at all, are you kind of annoyed with the error messages? There are a number of different error messages that get popped up anytime you make a connection between user and computer. And when you add in the gateway, it actually makes things even a little bit more complex as well. And the reason is that Microsoft is attempting to create a situation where the RDP file itself, right, the text file that makes that connection from user to ultimately to server, can't get hacked in some way to send you to the wrong direction, or to some sort of phishing attack to have you connect into a server that looks like your server but is not actually your server. What Microsoft really wants is they want some mechanism so that that file itself can be encrypted, or at least authenticated, I guess I should say. So for reasons of scripting security, Microsoft requires an authentication of the RDP file itself to the server in order to eliminate a lot of these error messages. The error messages themselves, they kind of confuse the users. They're painful for us. Now, in the Remote App Console, you'll notice another tab there called Digital Signature. Okay, this Digital Signature tab provides a mechanism for you to essentially sign any of the files that this server creates. Okay, remember back in the beginning of this session when I was talking about the 5 different mechanisms for deploying RDP files? Well, when I sign those files with a digital certificate, it effectively, first of all, eliminates one of the error messages. And secondly, it allows that file to be distributed without fear of that file getting manipulated or changed by a bad guy, or somebody that's even a good guy that's poking around in the file. You'll know this. You'll see here, you go to Digital Signature. If you have the signature, if you have the appropriate signature that you're looking for, you'll find that signature. I can bring it up over here. Here under the Digital Signature tab. Okay, here I see the sign with the digital certificate. If I change to a different digital certificate, you'll find the certificates that are available on this machine. If I don't see this box, then that means that those certificates have not been installed at the proper location. But you'll see I have both of these certificates, and I can assign either one of them to this server. And any of the files that get created by this server, any of the RDP files that get created, will have that certificate essentially at the bottom of the file. If a user attempts to modify the file in any way, well, the file just simply won't work because it won't pass their certificate requirement. So signing that file creates the necessary authentication between the client and the server. It prevents any kind of tampering, because whether you're using web access or distributing RDP files or whatever mechanism that you're doing in order to get those files from the user to, or from the server to the user, you're essentially deploying an RDP file, and you want to specifically prevent that file from being tampered with. If anybody tries to modify the file, well, simply it just won't work. And the only downfall is that if once you implement this, instead of seeing an error message, the user gets asked, well, do you trust the publisher of this remote app program? And if they click yes, they can choose to don't ask me again. But at least this gets the user through the RDG appropriately and ensures that you have that authentication in place. So some final thoughts here. Extending those applications to the internet. With the right technologies, really it's not that difficult. Right? Getting your applications, your existing application infrastructure extended out into the internet requires just a little bit of extra technology. Right? You have to remember, obviously, the Active Directory architecture that you have there. You have to be conscious of that internal DNS resolution and the external DNS resolution as well, because users have to be able to find those services. You have to be aware of what those certificates are, and most importantly, you have to be conscious of what your deployment options are. So with that, I'd like to open the floor for questions. The difference in experience to the user is relatively transparent. I mean, it's there in order to provide that mechanism, but it's designed to be transparent to the user. It's really whatever your requirements are. I couldn't answer that. Yeah. Another question. All right, guys. Well, thank you. Oh, in the back. In the back.
The reverse proxy and back to the RDP gateway. That's what? SSL or HTTP?
That can be either an HTTP connection, or it can be an SSL connection through HTTPS. So you have the option of selecting whether you want to go one versus the other. I keep doing this, it's the wrong computer. You have the option of selecting whether or not you want to use, well, SSL or traditional HTTP up here under the server settings here. And you can choose whether you don't want to do HTTPS to HTTPS or HTTPS to regular HTTP, I believe here under SSL bridging. That's the mechanism you'll use. Enable that whenever you have something like a reverse proxy in place.
Question. If you're using, I've never used the RD gateway before. Does the RDP file contain the final destination server's address and the gateway's address?
Correct. Both the final destination's address and the gateway's address are going to be contained within that RDP file. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for your time. Again, my name is Greg Shields with Concentrated Technology, and you're very welcome for getting you out so you can get first in line for beer. Have a great day, guys.